Hi everyone, and welcome to the 7th of 14 nights of storytelling, each story to be loaded at 8:30 p.m. So that we can all share them together. My name is Julie Hartley and I'm one of the directors of Centauri Arts. We have summer camps for kids, creative writing retreats for adults, and year-round classes in creative writing and other art forms for teenagers and adults. So people from all those spheres of what we do are joining us for these stories, as well as campers from other camps. And also we have a women's shelter that's joining us for these stories every evening, so welcome. And lots of friends and family and camp parents and many people, so welcome to all of you. Why are we doing this? Well, because creative writing and storytelling have been linking communities together for thousands of years. And what we need right now more than anything is a community link. So I'm hoping that's what that's what this story and all the stories will provide. So I'm going to launch straight in tonight. This is actually the third of three stories that explore very traditional stories that may have influenced Shakespeare. And you'll see there is one thing in the story that could well have been something that influenced Shakespeare when he was writing. So I'll let you see if you can figure out what that is. Please remember that these are told stories. They're not being read, they're being told. These are from my memory, and these are just sort of impromptu. So if I slip up, please forgive me. If it's there's some umming and ahhing, please forgive me. That's part of the human part of this, I think. So what I'm going to invite you to do is, if you haven't already, just grab your favorite pillow or cushion or drink or snack or whatever it is you want to make yourself feel cozy, and gather together with whoever is hearing the story with you. And as you close your eyes, I'd like you to picture a room filled with people, because when we tell these stories at camp, that's what happens. We all come together and we all lie down in our own spaces in the theatre across the stage area, and that's how we share in the stories together. We do it with theatre lights, we do it with soft music, and the idea is that we're all sharing an experience together, using our imaginations to create something that is not the here and now. So tonight's story is called The Prince and the Giant's Daughter. It's a bit of an epic, so I'm really excited to tell it. I've been telling it at camp for the last about 3 or 4 years, and we're now about to start. So I would invite everybody to close your eyes and join me for this evening's experience, which is called The Prince and the Giant's Daughter. Once upon a time, a long time ago, there was a prince by the name of Ian. Ian was a young man and was not particularly a good person. He was weak, he was faithless, he didn't understand the importance of keeping his word when he gave it. But there was one good and truthful and honest thing, one kind thing that Ian did as a young man, and that's the event that begins this story. Ian was walking through a forest far from home when he came upon a raven being attacked by a snake. And as he saw this attack in progress, something woke inside of him, some compassion, and he seized his sword and he slashed out at the snake, and the raven was released from the snake's grasp and flew up onto a nearby tree. And immediately the raven transformed into a member of the fairy folk, a powerful member with lots of strength and special magic ways. And he stood before Ian and he said, "You have saved my life, and for that act of kindness I will give you something in this sack." And he pulled from behind his back a sack filled with something bulging and large, and he handed the sack to Ian. And he said, "The sack is sealed. Carry the sack to the place where you would most like to live for your whole life, and then open the sack and see what happens. Do you promise me that you will not open this sack until you reach the place you would most like to live?" And Ian nodded and agreed and said, "I promise." And the member of the fairy folk, this young and powerful man, said, "Ian, you must do this, for if you break faith and you open this sack in a place where you do not wish to reside, terrible things could happen in the future." And Ian nodded and promised that he would indeed carry this gift, carry this sack filled with whatever it held, and take it to the very place where he wanted to spend the rest of his life. And at that, the member of the fairy folk vanished into thin air, and Ian was once again left alone. So he shouldered the sack, and he began to walk towards his father's palace. And as he walked, a great curiosity came upon him. He wondered what it was he carried, and he thought surely it wouldn't hurt just to loosen the drawstring on the sack just a little bit and look inside and see what the sack contained. And those thoughts grew bigger and inside his head all day long as he walked through a dense, dark forest, until eventually it didn't seem important to him that he'd given his word and that he'd promised that he wouldn't open the sack, and he thought, I'm not actually going to open it. I'll just peek inside and see what's there. So he stopped in the middle of this deep, dark, sinister-looking forest, probably the last place on earth he would ever want to live for the rest of his life. And he put the sack on the ground, and he loosened the drawstrings at the top of the sack. And immediately a gigantic palace sprung out of the sack. And there in the middle of this terrible forest was the most glorious palace he could ever imagine. Well, Ian was delighted to see this palace, for he could not imagine himself living anywhere more wonderful, except this palace had taken root in the very last place he would ever want to spend his life, a place where dark magic clearly resided. And sure enough, before Ian could think on this too much, the ground began to shake, and it shook and it shook and it shook until he saw ahead of him, charging through these dark and terrible trees, a huge and fearsome giant. And the giant stood in front of him, and he looked down at Ian, and he said, "You have invaded my lands." And Ian apologized, and he tried to tell the giant what had happened, but the giant wouldn't listen. He said, "I will punish you. I will eat you for the terrible deed you have done." And Ian begged the giant, and he said, "Look, I'm a prince. I will do whatever you want. Please don't eat me." And the giant paused a little, and he said, "Okay, I have magic. I can put your palace back in your sack and allow you to continue along your way, except I want something in return." "What is that?" said Ian. "I promise I'll do anything." And he was thinking to him all the time, whatever I promise to do, I can break my promise later on, because of course he was weak and not very truthful. And the giant said, "I will put this palace back in the sack for you, and you may continue along your way. But one day you will get married, and you will have a child. And when that child is 7 years old, you must turn the child over to me." And Ian thought for a moment. And at first he thought, that's too terrible. That would be heir to my kingdom. That would be my child, my baby. I don't know if I can do that. But he was young, and the idea of even one day being married and one day having a child, and that child being 7 years old, well, those things seemed kind of impossible. And he thought, well, if it even should ever happen, of course I can just break my word and I can lie, and the giant need never know I even have a child. I'll figure this out somehow. And so he promised to the giant that on the occasion that he should have a child, and that child should reach 7 years old, that he would hand the child over to the giant. "Fair enough," said the giant. "Your promise is binding. You cannot break it." And suddenly the palace crumpled and disappeared back into Ian's sack. And Ian shouldered the sack and continued on his way through the deep dark forest that belonged to the giant, out the other side, into his father's land. And when he reached his father's palace, he opened the sack once again, and in the beautiful fertile valley where his father lived, the palace sprung up. So now there were 2 great palaces side by side, one that belonged to the king of the land, and one that belonged to Prince Ian, who would one day inherit everything. And the years went by, and Prince Ian continued to be faithless and weak and not at all true to his word. So everybody saw him this way, and everybody believed that one day the kingdom would have a weak king indeed. And the years went by, and Prince Ian married, and the two of them had a child, a baby boy. And only at the back of his mind did Ian occasionally recall the promise he'd made to the giant. And even when he did, he thought, when the time comes, I will deceive the giant, for I can do things like that. And then the years went by, and on the day that his child, a boy they had called Michael, on the day that Michael reached the age of 7 years old, the ground began to shake, and it shook, and it shook, and it shook, until the giant appeared from outside the trees and stood a fearsome and huge shadow on the valley. And Ian came out and stood in front of the giant. And the giant said, Prince Ian, do you remember what you have promised to give me? And Ian thought quickly, and he said, yes, I do. You may have my son. I will go and fetch him. And being the faithless and weak and untrustworthy and not at all good human being that Prince Ian was, he rushed to the first 7-year-old he found in the street, which happened to be the butcher's son, and he took him by the hand, and he led him out to the giant. This is my son, he told the giant. Now take him and go. And Ian rushed inside and slammed shut the door to his palace. Well, the giant was not so easily fooled, and he leaned down to the small child and he said, if I gave you a stick, what would you do with it? Well, said the child, who was incredibly brave and not at all afraid of the giant, if you gave me a stick, I help my father all the time, and so I would use the stick to hang up the carcasses inside our butcher's shop. And the giant realized he had been deceived, and he took the boy and he lifted him over the walls of the palace and placed him back in front of his father's shop, and he stomped until the ground shook. And Prince Ian came out again, and the giant said, you must not deceive me, for I will see through any treachery. Now bring me your son. And Prince Ian rushed back inside, a little more afraid this time, and he looked down the streets and he saw another 7-year-old, and he plucked the 7-year-old and he took him by the hand and he ran outside with him and deposited him in front of the giant, ran back inside and slammed shut the door to the palace. And the huge giant leaned down to the child, and he had a test he would give a second time. And he said, child, if I gave you a stick, what would you do with it? Well, said the child, who was very courageous and not at all afraid of the giant, if you gave me a stick, I would go out into the fields where my father takes care of his sheep, and helping him in the fields, I would use this stick to beat back the wolves, for we've been shepherds for generations and we've never lost a sheep yet. And the giant realized he'd been deceived again, and gently he picked up the child, lifted him over the walls of the palace, deposited him where his frightened father stood in the streets, and yelled for Prince Ian to come out again. And Prince Ian came out and realized that the giant could not be deceived, and the giant could not be defeated. You try and trick me again, roared the giant, and I will flatten your palace and the palace of your father, and I will seize your kingdom by force. Now give me your son. And sadly, Ian went back inside, and he took his son, and he handed him over to the giant. Well, the giant took Michael and led him through the forest to his own palace, where he lived with his 3 daughters, none of whom were giantesses, because their mother had not been. And now, although their mother was dead, the 3 daughters lived with the giant, their father, and Michael was placed amongst them to be reared with the 3 of them. And he was relatively happy. The 2 elder daughters were mean-spirited and cruel, and they teased him and bullied him. But the 3rd daughter, the daughter that was the most favoured by everyone in the kingdom for her wisdom and her courage, well, she became a great companion to Michael, and the 2 of them grew to adulthood together, first as friends, and then, as time grew on, falling in love with one another. And then finally, the day came that the giant had planned for all along. And he called Michael to him, and he said, "Michael, you have proven yourself worthy of marrying one of my daughters. And so I will give you the hand of one of my daughters in marriage. And you will then rule over my kingdom one day with my daughter, and my daughter and you will rule one day over your father's kingdom too." Of course, the giant had intended this all along. "But there is one thing you must know," said the giant. "You may choose between my first daughter and my second daughter, but you may not have my third daughter, for she is wise and strong and good and courageous, and she will remain with me for all her days to take care of me when I am old." Well, Michael was incredibly dismayed at this, and so was the third daughter, who he had grown to love and who loved him just as strongly. And he shook his head and he said, "No, I will certainly marry one of your daughters, but it will be your third daughter, for I love her and she loves me, and you know that." And the giant was furious. He took Michael and he ordered him to be locked in his deepest, darkest dungeon. "Every day," he said, "you will be brought to me, and I will ask you the same question every day. Do you agree to marry my elder or my second daughter? And when you agree, you will be released from the dungeon, and until then you will spend your life there." Well, Michael was afraid, and he cowered in the corner of the dungeon and waited for the hours to go by and wondered what it was he should do. He thought, "I have to keep faith, but how can I spend my life in a dungeon?" But that night, the giant's third daughter, who was loved by everyone, asked the jailer to let her into the dungeons. And he agreed. And the third daughter came and stood before Michael. And she said, "Michael, there is actually another reason that my father will not let me marry you. For of the three of us, I am the one that has inherited all of his magical powers. And so he does not want those powers to be in your hands or to be in the hands of anyone but him. But here I can use my powers to get us what we want. You must only do one thing. Remain faithful to me and never agree to marry either of my sisters, and I will see to it that we have our way and that we get to marry and spend our lifetime together. All you have to do, Michael, is remain faithful." For the third daughter, although she loved Michael, she'd heard rumors of Michael's father and how he behaved, and she was a little worried Michael could not do this. "I will remain faithful," Michael said. "I will never agree to marry your sisters." So the next day, Michael was brought out of the dungeon, and he was stood before the king, the giant himself. "Have you agreed now to marry one of my two elder daughters?" the giant asked. And Michael shook his head and said no, he had not. And he was tossed back in the dungeon. And that night, his true love came to see him again. And he noticed how beautiful she was, and he noticed three things about her that he had never before noticed. He noticed, first of all, that she always wore a cloak that was made of what seemed to be the blackest fur. And he noticed that she had hair that went down to her waist that was the thickest ever, and also that looked something like black feathers. And he noticed also that she had fingers, long and slender and strong. And he wondered why these three things had never stood out to him before, but they stood out to him now. "Keep faith, Michael," she said to him, "whatever happens." And she disappeared. And the next day Michael was brought out of the dungeon again and stood before the giant. "Well," said the giant, "have you agreed to marry one of my two elder daughters?" "I have not," Michael said. "I will marry only your third daughter." And so it went on, day after day after day, until Michael's clothing grew to rags, and until Michael had proven to the giant's third daughter that beyond everything else he was loyal and true, despite what his father was like. And then she realized that she could love nobody in her life but him. And there came a time, thankfully, that the giant grew tired of bringing Michael before him day after day. And the giant decided to approach things a little differently. And one day, when Michael was led to him in chains, he turned to him and he said, So I've decided I will set you 3 tasks. And if you should succeed at these 3 tasks, all of which will be very difficult, then I will allow you to marry my 3rd daughter. However, if you fail at any one of the tasks, you will be executed. Fair enough, said Michael. I will take your tasks. And he hoped beyond hope, that the magic that his true love possessed could outwit the magic of her father. Then here is the 3rd task, the first task, said the giant. You must go out into the forest, and you must hunt for bears. And in the space of 1 day, you must carpet my entire forest, my entire palace, in the fur of bears. If the carpet stretches through the entire palace, then I will give you my daughter's hand in marriage. But you must do this within the space of 1 day and night. Well, at this, Michael was very dismayed, because not only did he think this was impossible, but he was not very good at killing, and he didn't like killing anything. But because he had no choice, he shouldered his bow and arrow, and he rode out into the forest. And all day long he rode, and he saw not a single bear, which was quite unusual. But he wondered if that was part of an enchantment, if that was part of the trick the giant was playing upon him. And when he came to the end of the day, quite despondent, he laid down under a tree and fell asleep. And he woke the next morning, knowing that he could not flee for his life, which is probably the sensible thing to do, but he had to return to the palace, because he was a person of his word. And so he rode back into the palace, and to his absolute total amazement, the entire palace was carpeted in the fur of bears. I don't know how you managed this, said the giant, but you must go back to your dungeon for the night, and tomorrow I will give you the next task. Well, he was tossed back in the dungeon, and that night his true love came to visit him again. And he noticed that although she still had her thick black hair, and he noticed also the beauty of her long, slender fingers, she was no longer wearing her cloak of fur. And she said to him, You have remained true to me so far, Michael. Do not slip up now, for tomorrow the task will be still harder. But you must be equal to it, you must agree to do it, and together we will be free. So the next morning Michael was brought before the giant again, and this time the giant said, You must go out into the forest and hunt for crows. You must cover every wall of my palace with the feathers of crows, and if you should manage this, then you can marry my daughter. But of course there's a 3rd task still to go as well. And so Michael rode out into the forest, just as dismayed as he had been the day before, for not only was he not very good at killing things, he also didn't like to kill anything at all. And all day long, though he looked through the forest for crows, he saw not a single one. And that night, just as the night before, he fell asleep under a tree. And when he woke the next morning, he thought for an instant about escaping for his life. But he thought, no, I can't do this. I must go back. I promised. And so he rode back into the palace. And he was amazed to see that every single wall of the palace was covered in the feathers of crows. I don't know how you did this, said the giant, but you will return to my dungeons, and tomorrow you will face the 3rd and hardest task of all. And he tossed Michael back in the dungeons. And that night, the giant's daughter came to him again, and he saw that not only was she not wearing her long black cloak of fur, but her beautiful black hair was now cut short. And he wondered at this. You must remain faithful for just 1 more day, she told him, and then we will be free to spend our lives together. And the next morning, Michael was taken out of the dungeon, and the giant and all the lords and ladies of the palace followed him as he was taken to the banks of the lake. And the lake at the side of the palace, there was the biggest and tallest tree Michael had ever seen. It stretched almost into the sky. At the top of this tree, said the giant, there is a magpie's nest, and inside the magpie's nest there is a ring. Bring me that ring, and if you achieve this third and final task, you are free to marry my daughter." Well, Michael looked at the tree and saw that for almost the whole length of the tree trunk there wasn't a single foothold or a single handhold. He didn't know how he was going to do it. But the giant's third daughter ran forward as if just to embrace him and whispered to Michael, "Trust me on this. You must climb with your eyes closed, and the footfalls will appear and you will be able to get a hold as you climb the tree. But you must promise me that on the way down, as you climb down with the ring, you will collect each of the footholds and you will bring them down with you and you will hand them back to me." Well, Michael promised, and he closed his eyes, and he reached up the trunk and sure enough found something he could grab hold of. It felt like a stick, but it was incredibly strong. And using these footholds, he began to climb the trunk of the tree. And he climbed until he got to the very top. And to his amazement, he reached into the magpie's nest, and sure enough, there was a ring. And he reached out with the ring, and he climbed down the tree. But as he climbed down, he grew more and more jubilant that here he was almost succeeding. And although he collected each of the footholds one by one on the way down, he got too excited when he got near the ground, and he forgot the final one. And instead of reaching to the final foothold, he leapt to the ground. And he handed back to the giant's daughter, the handful of things that he'd collected on the way down. And she asked him where the final one was, and he realized he'd missed it. And he opened his eyes and saw in front of him that the giant's daughter looked just as she always had, but that one finger was missing from her left hand. And he was horrified to realize what it was he'd been using to climb with, and that he had been responsible for the loss of one of her fingers. But she shook her head and said, "This is a small price to pay. Do not worry. You mostly kept faith with everything I asked, and now we will be free to spend our lives together." But the ground was rumbling. The giant was stomping his feet in rage, and the two of them began to wonder if he would keep faith with them. "I've completed the 3 tasks that you asked," Michael said. "Now you must set us free to live our lives together and as we wish." But the giant said, "I'm going to set you a quick 4th task, and if you are true to my daughter, you will be able to solve it. And that is, you must pick her out from her 2 sisters. Follow me to the hall." And the 3 girls rushed ahead of Michael, and he and the giant followed. And when Michael reached the hall, he saw 3 figures shrouded in black from head to toe. Somebody had thrown over them black sheets and blankets until all they were 3 black mounds of fabric. "How could I possibly pick out my true love from these 3 mounds?" he asked the giant. "Well, if you cannot, then you do not love her, and you are not worthy of her," said the giant. And all of a sudden, Michael saw, reaching out from underneath one of the piles, a hand, and the hand was missing a finger. "There is my true love," he shouted triumphantly. "There she is, and now we must be allowed to marry." And the girls tossed the blankets and the coverlets off from themselves, and he was right. This was the giant's 3rd daughter. And she grabbed hold of his hand. "Come," she shouted, "we must be quick." And the 2 of them, before the giant could stop his raging and his stomping, and before the giant could think clearly, they ran to the stables, where they took the fastest horse. "We must be gone from the kingdom," the giant's daughter said. "Come." And the 2 of them got on the horse, and they galloped away from the giant's kingdom. And so the giant's daughter and Prince Michael galloped away from the giant's palace on their horse. And the horse was faster than the wind, and they thought for the longest time that they would outrun the giant. But then the ground began to shake, and the giant's daughter turned to Michael, and she said, "I feel my father breathing down my neck. He is catching up with us. You must reach inside the horse's ear and take what you find there and toss it behind us." Well, Michael reached inside the horse's ear, and there he found a twig, and he tossed the twig behind them, and a huge forest grew up behind them on the trail. And instantly behind them they saw the giant try to fight his way through the forest. "Faster," Michael said, "let's go faster." And so they galloped faster and harder, swifter than the wind. And for the longest time, Michael thought they had outrun the giant, that the giant was still caught amongst the forest. But then they heard the ground shaking again, and the giant's daughter whispered in Michael's ear, "I feel my father breathing down my neck. Reach inside the horse's ear and see what you find." And Michael reached inside the horse's ear and found there a small stone. "Toss it behind us on the trail," shouted the giant's daughter. Michael did so, and a huge cliff formed behind them. And they carried on, and they saw the giant standing on the cliff, hacking at the rock, trying to get through it. And their horse galloped on and galloped further and further, and Michael thought they were now free of the giant. But suddenly the ground shook again. "Oh no," said the giant's daughter, "there is but one thing left, and I had hoped never to have to do this. Reach inside the horse's ear one last time." And Michael did this. He reached inside the horse's ear, and there was a single drop of water. He tossed it behind him, and they found that behind them was a huge and turbulent sea. And they looked to the other side of this sea, and they saw the giant stand on the shores. "My father does not swim," whispered the giant's daughter sadly. "I did not want to do this." "But he would have killed me," said Michael, "and he would have done whatever he could to catch us and to kill us both." And they watched as the giant waded out into the ocean and sank up to his neck and disappeared forever in the turbulent waters. And the giant's daughter was despondent as they turned the horse away from the ocean and galloped onwards. And within days they came to a hill overlooking the home that had been Michael's for the first 7 years of his life, the home where his family still lived. "I haven't seen it in so long," Michael said, "and now I cannot wait to share it with you. But you must let me go down there first. I must pave the way, for to bring home somebody and to say this person must be my wife, maybe that's a little bit too much for them to take in at once. Let me see all my family again. Let me talk to them slowly about you, and tomorrow you can join me in the palace." Well, the giant's daughter was really frightened at this idea. She said, "We need to stay together after all we've been through." "Well, I have to do this," Michael said. "Please trust me. You've trusted me so far. Trust me in this." "You don't understand," said the giant's daughter. "There is an enchantment, one final enchantment, that my father placed upon me. If you should allow anyone to embrace you while you're in the palace, you will forget I exist forever." "I won't do that," Michael said. "I promise. I'll keep faith with you. No one will embrace me, only you." "Then go," she said. "I've trusted you and you've kept faith with me all along. Keep faith with me in this, and I will see you tomorrow." So Michael walked down the hillside, a huge smile on his face, knowing that he was about to build a life for the two of them forever. And he walked in through the door of the palace, and everyone was excited to see him, and the crowds milled around him. But he said, "No, no one may embrace me. I'll tell you why soon, but no one may embrace me." And so everyone kept faith with his request, and he went into the banqueting hall, and everyone laid out a feast, and there was great joy and happiness in the palace that day. And everything went according to plan, until someone opened the door to a hound that suddenly recalled Michael as his owner years and years ago. And the hound was so excited to see the little boy returned a man that he bounded into the room, and before anyone could stop him, least of all Michael, the hound leapt at Michael, and Michael instinctively wrapped his arms around it. And instantly he forgot all about the giant's daughter. He forgot what it was to be in love. He forgot everything. And the days went by, and the giant's daughter sat on the hillside and waited for Michael until she was forced to accept that he would not be returning, and until she was forced to accept she might never see him again. "He has embraced another. she thought sadly. He has forgotten me forever. My father has won, and we will never spend our lives together as we'd hoped. And slowly she fell into a deep, dark sadness. And as the days turned into weeks, she was no longer able to eat, no longer able to drink. She no longer had the will to live. And she may have died there on the hillside, had it not been for a passing troop of travelling players. People who dragged their wagons from village to village throughout the kingdom, performing plays. And they saw this girl sitting on the hillside, and they decided that she should join them and that they would nurse her back to health. And they told her something that gave her back the will to live. They said, at the point in your life where nothing else seems worth it, there's always stories. For stories will transport you to other worlds. Join us now and use what you've lived to tell stories to others, and use the stories of others to keep you strong in the times when life seems darkest. And so she joined the travelling troupe and regained her strength and told some of the greatest stories of magic and love and trust and strength and faith that any of them had ever heard. So the travelling troupe grew in power as it went from one village to another, and everyone looked forward to its arrival. And while the stories of others kept the giant's daughter strong, the stories she told gave others strength too. And day after day, week after week, they told their stories in marketplaces, she being one of their greatest storytellers, their greatest actors, and everyone waited for their arrival. Until they received, about a year later, a very special invitation. They received a messenger from Prince Ian far away. He told them that his son, Prince Michael, had been in a deep, dark depression all year long, and that in order to lift him from this depression, the king was forcing upon him a journey to the other side of the world to marry a princess there. And before he departed unwillingly for this journey, a banquet would be held in his honour, and the aim would be to cheer him up. And what better way to cheer up the prince than stories? So the travelling troupe was to be invited to the kingdom to tell a story for the prince before he set out on his journey. And immediately, when the giant's daughter heard the messenger's tale, she hatched a plan. And everybody in the travelling troupe was willing to work with her on this plan. And she wrote the story that would be the most important story of her whole life. And she would act in it as its hero. And they went from village to village until they finally reached the palace where Prince Ian and Prince Michael were waiting. And there was a great banqueting hall there and a huge feast set out. And the two princes, the father and the son, were waiting to listen to the story. And the travelling troupe set up, and the giant's daughter began to tell the tale as they acted it behind her. Once upon a time, she said, there was a prince who was walking through a forest, and in the middle of the forest he saw a snake about to eat a raven, and he killed the snake, and the raven was really one of the fairy folk, and the fairy folk gave him a wish. And he gave him a sack with something inside, and he told Prince Ian that he shouldn't open the sack until he got to the place where he most wanted to live, but he did. He opened it in a forest, and on the story went until the point where the giant's daughter herself entered the story. And she told the tale of how she'd fallen in love, and she told the tale of her father's anger and the 3 tests, and the way they had galloped for their life away from the palace. And she told the story of the great forest, and she told the story of the cliff and her father's death in the lake. And she looked over at the prince, and she came to the point where she and the prince were on the hillside over Prince Michael's palace, and she told the story of how he had walked down into the palace, and then she looked at him, and Prince Michael looked at her. And I forgot all about you, he said, leaping from his throne. I was embraced by my dog, and I forgot all about you. And she smiled, and he ran onto the stage, and the two of them were lost in an embrace that meant they recalled everything about who they were, their dreams together, and how they had trusted one another beyond all else. And the play ended there, because the ending was really the next day, when instead of setting off on a giant sea voyage that may last the rest of his life, Prince Michael married the love of his life, the giant's daughter. And there was a great feast and a huge wedding, and the entire palace celebrated. And knowing what it was to keep faith and be true, the two of them were granted control of the whole kingdom. And as time came to pass, they became rulers like none other, good and true and courageous and honest and kind. But more than anything else, Prince Michael and the giant's daughter lived happily ever after. And that was the story of the prince and the giant's daughter. Thank you for listening, and we'll have another story for you tomorrow night.